Luke chapter 23 describes the trial, crucifixion, and death of Jesus, culminating in his burial. It is one of the most significant chapters in the New Testament, as it chronicles the events that led to Jesus' sacrificial death for the sins of the world. The chapter highlights the injustice and suffering Jesus endured, his forgiveness toward his enemies, and the fulfillment of God's plan for salvation. In verses 1 through 12, the whole assembly of the Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, accusing him of claiming to be king of the Jews, which they argue is a threat to Roman authority. Pilate questions Jesus, asking if he is the king of the Jews. Pilate finds no basis for the accusations against Jesus and declares that he is not guilty of any crime. However, the chief priests and the crowd continue to demand Jesus' execution. Pilate learns that Jesus is from Galilee and sends him to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, who is in Jerusalem at the time. Herod questions Jesus but receives no answer from him. The chief priests and teachers of the law accuse Jesus vehemently, but Jesus remains silent. Herod, frustrated, mocks Jesus by dressing him in a royal robe and sending him back to Pilate. Despite Herod's indifference, Pilate still cannot find any reason to sentence Jesus to death. The key message is the injustice of both the Roman and Jewish leaders. In verses 13 through 16, Pilate gathers the chief priests, rulers, and people to announce that he has found no guilt in Jesus. He offers to have Jesus punished and released, as was customary for the governor to release one prisoner during the Passover festival. Pilate is hoping the crowd will choose to release Jesus, but the religious leaders stir up the people to ask for the release of a notorious criminal, Barabbas, instead. In verses 17 through 25, Pilate asks the crowd who they want to be released, Jesus or Barabbas. The crowd demands Barabbas, a murderer. Pilate, confused by this decision, asks what should be done with Jesus, and they all shout, "Crucify him!" Pilate questions the crowd again, but they insist on Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate, seeing that he cannot change their minds, gives in to the crowd's demands and sentences Jesus to be crucified. Pilate releases Barabbas and hands over Jesus to be crucified. The key message is that we see how easily a crowd can influence people. In verses 26 through 31, Jesus is led away by Roman soldiers to the place of execution, called Golgotha, meaning the skull. As they march to Golgotha, a large crowd follows, including women who mourn and lament for Jesus. Jesus tells them not to weep for him, but for themselves and their children, prophesying the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the hardship that will fall on future generations. The key message is that Jesus' words about weeping for themselves highlight that the judgment on the city is coming because they have rejected him. In verses 32 through 43, Jesus is crucified along with two criminals. As he is nailed to the cross, he prays, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The soldiers cast lots, a form of gambling, to divide Jesus' clothes among themselves. The crowd stands watching, and the rulers mock him. The soldiers and the people continue to mock Jesus. Even one of the criminals crucified with him insults him, saying, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." However, the other criminal rebukes him, acknowledging that they are receiving just punishment for their crimes, but Jesus is innocent. The second criminal, who repents, asks Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. Jesus responds, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." The key message is that this moment shows Jesus' grace and his ability to save even in the final moments of life. In verses 44 through 53, darkness covers the land from noon to 3 p.m., a supernatural sign of the significance of Jesus' death. At 3 p.m., Jesus cries out with a loud voice, saying, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He breathes his last breath. The temple curtain is torn in two from top to bottom, symbolizing the end of the separation between God and humanity through Jesus' sacrifice. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council and a secret follower of Jesus, goes to Pilate and asks for Jesus' body. He places it in a tomb cut out of rock, which had never been used. After preparing the body with spices and linen, Joseph lays Jesus' body in the tomb, and rolls a stone in front of the entrance. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee observe the burial and prepare to return home to prepare additional spices and perfumes for his body. But the Sabbath is about to begin, so they rest according to the commandment. The key message is, Jesus is prepared with some spices, wrapped in linen and buried in the tomb. Jesus' trial, sentencing, crucifixion, death, and burial are also covered in Matthew chapter 27, Mark chapter 15, and John chapter 19. Luke chapter 23 has 5 key themes. 1. Jesus endures injustice and mockery throughout his trial and crucifixion, yet he responds with forgiveness and grace. His willingness to suffer for humanity's sins is central to his mission. 2. Jesus' words on the cross, "Father, forgive them," and his promise to the penitent criminal demonstrate his capacity for forgiveness, even in the midst of the most extreme suffering. 3. Throughout the trial, Pilate, Herod, and even the centurion recognize that Jesus is innocent, yet he is still sentenced to die. This highlights the depth of his sacrifice. He, the innocent Lamb of God, dies for the guilty. 4. The temple veil tearing symbolizes the new access to God through Jesus' death. No longer is there a barrier between God and humanity. Through Jesus' sacrifice, believers can now have direct access to the Father. 5. Jesus' death and burial are vital to the Christian faith, as they prepare for the resurrection. His death is not the end, but the necessary sacrifice for the salvation of mankind. Luke 23 shows the fulfillment of God's plan for redemption through Jesus' death on the cross. It is a chapter of great suffering, but also of great grace and forgiveness. Through Jesus' willingness to die, he offers salvation to all who would believe in him. Luke 23 challenges us to reflect on the cost of salvation and the depth of God's love for humanity.